elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Today, Connor and I are going to share some ideas with you about how to exercise free speech effectively. And Connor, I think this is a topic whose time has come in the sense that what passes for free speech today is very widely disagreed upon, and in fact, in some cases, particularly I'm thinking about what's happening on some of the college campuses, free speech is actually actively curtailed if it's something that certain people don't agree with.
Yeah, certainly. I think the climate is one that is not inviting of free speech, right? There's definitely opposition, and I think, I don't know. I guess I wonder why that is, but I think today we want to more brainstorm how you, the listener, how we collectively can use our free speech effectively. I think you're right to point out the climate is one that is very, hostile. Perhaps it's more our awareness because of social media and the information age, and perhaps, there have always been free speech problems, I would surmise. But let's get into it. Brian, what do we mean by ideas to exercise free speech effectively? How does that relate to your average Joe?
Okay, the first thing I'd like to do is let's start by talking about what free speech is and why it matters, just so that we have kind of a baseline from which to operate. When I say free speech, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
My first thing is that it's dissent. It's controversial. I don't think free speech is protected and needed so that, people can tweet their latest meal and collect design ideas on Pinterest and, because, right, who cares? Like, what government is ever going to care about that stuff? I think the right to free speech, the constitutional protections, the litigation, the fight over free speech is to say things that are unpopular, to say things especially that are potentially a threat or undermining the government. I think that's where free speech, where the rubber meets the road, is in controversial and especially political type speech.
Okay, and I would agree with you entirely. I will take it one step further, and I'm going to paint a very broad picture here of free speech. It certainly incorporates what you're talking about. I would include the free and open exchange of ideas, free of interference, free of censorship, free of the need to suppress this point of view because everybody knows we don't really need to hear anything about that. I guess I'm talking more about like a free market for ideas, where good ideas will carry the day and bad ideas may find their way into the market. But like in the free market, when a bad business model comes along or a bad business idea, it appears, and then it is shown the door by the market forces.
And so maybe the spectrum of free speech is one where we need a more level playing field, right? So back in the day when there were, the 3 TV stations and Walter Cronkite, and there was much more information control, there was a big bottleneck, right? The free speech was kind of out of balance. There were people who kind of controlled thought a lot more than today, where it's been democratized, decentralized, leveled far more. You have many TV stations, you have websites, you have radio stations, you have all of these outlets where for the average person who wants to engage in free speech, it's a lot easier. So I think speech is now freer in the sense that it's easier to not obtain, but it's easier to exercise. It's easier to get your ideas out there, especially and importantly, if they are, go against the mainstream or they're controversial.
And that's exactly where I was hoping we would head. I believe that it is easier today to exercise your free speech than ever before. And I'm going to say that with the caveat that, unfortunately, a lot of people, and I'll include myself in this, we exercise our free speech in ways that feel good, and we're certainly exercising it, but they're not necessarily effective or as effective as we hope that they could be. In other words, the people who chant slogans, that is free speech. They're entitled to do that. Is it actually having impact? Is it actually having a positive effect?
I think one thing to consider first before we perhaps get into the more acute things that pertain to free speech is just how to have effective speech. And I think when people are exercising my right to free speech, they're thinking protest, they're thinking tirades, and they're thinking rants. And, those things are important and all well and good, but I think some of the best free speech is very well thought out, very articulate, evidence-based criticisms or investigative journalism that uncovers a government conspiracy or points to a big problem or whatever, right? And so it's not just the protest-oriented speech. It's the ability to, show that the emperor has no clothes, right? And I think if you're going to persuade people, if the idea about speech is to bring others to your cause and persuade them, I think it's very important to consider how to just have effective speech. And it's not just being angry all the time. It's not machine gun conversation where you're just firing at everybody and, hoping that you come out victorious. And I say this as one who is guilty of those types of things in the past. I've had to learn myself, coming out of college, I was very much I'm right, you're wrong. I need to stay up on Facebook till 3 a.m. arguing with people because I'm going to convert the masses, right? And so I've had to come through a progression in learning these very things, that to be effective in speech, you have to be diplomatic. You have to give the benefit of the doubt to the other person. You have to understand that in most cases, they are where you were 5 years ago or a year ago, right? And so would you have been open and receptive to someone who was further along the intellectual path than you to be critical of you? Or do you want them to be inviting of you and understanding that, well, look, I realize you've not encountered this information before. Let me talk to you about it, and maybe you'll kind of rethink your position rather than, you're wrong, you're listening to propaganda, blah, blah, And so I think we have to, if we care about speech in the broader sense of persuading and educating people, we have to do it effectively on its own, regardless of the content we're talking about.
It took me some years to learn this because talk radio is a medium where argumentation thrives and people love to throw down and they love to argue and they love that scorched earth, shouting at people and hanging up, get off my phone, you dope. But I found that one of the most effective ways to reach people, and by reach them, I don't necessarily mean change their mind, but just to get them to consider that, well, maybe there is a different way to look at this, is to approach it less from a I'm right, you're wrong approach and say, I see what you're trying to say, or acknowledge their point of view. So this is how you see things. Mm-hmm. And then I would use these words. And at the same time, I am looking at this consideration and I would spell out, this is why I may have a different take on it, which ultimately was me trying to say to them, I'm not trying to say that you're wrong and I'm right, or vice versa. What I'm trying to say is it possible that there's more to this issue than what you are currently seeing from your vantage point?
I'll argue maybe against both of our points here to say, Brian, I don't think what you just said is totally correct. I think you were trying, and as I do, I think you were trying to say that they're wrong. You're just trying to do it in a very nice way so as to not offend them and keep them open to your ideas. And I want you to respond to that because I do that too. I'll think in my mind, what are you thinking? You're totally wrong. But I'm going to outwardly be very kind and diplomatic and kind of build on mutual trust and take them from there. And so am I wrong in thinking that was kind of the motive, or was it more what you said?
It can certainly be taken as a roundabout way of showing, look, I'm not only right, but I'm also more clever than you. But in reality, what you're doing is you're leaving the possibility open. You may not be saying it in as many words, but you're saying, look, I could be wrong too, but clearly we're looking at this from differing vantage points. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that there's something in my point of view that can add to your understanding, and vice versa? In other words, it's less about who's going to win this exchange and more about, are we going to come away from this exchange with a better understanding, whether our minds have changed or not? And that's a hard thing to take because it requires you have to put your ego aside, and sometimes people will react like they're being attacked. I mean, we're trying to protect our mental universe from contradictions. But when I started doing that, I found more often than not people who had been vigorously arguing with me or vehemently opposed to me tended to come back at some later point in time and say, I thought about that and I see where you're coming from. Some of them may have changed their mind, some of them didn't, but at least they said there is another way to look at it.
So I want to talk about a slightly different angle as it pertains to free speech, and that is the platform of the speech. So I talked about back in the day we have the limited channels and no internet and so forth, and now it's very easy for people to get their views out. But even so, we face an environment where your speech might be limited or controlled or moderated. So by that I mean, let's say you're saying things that are very controversial on Twitter. Well, that's Twitter's platform, not yours. They can suspend your account, right? Other people can flag you, you can get suspended, and all of a sudden, all that time and energy you put into accumulating a following, poof, right? You lose your platform. Facebook, same thing.
Yep.
But also, I mean, these platforms, especially Facebook, as an example, is one of the leading kind of thought delivery tools or platforms out there. You can get you're subject to their ranking algorithm, so you can type the greatest content, and maybe you're friends with 4,000 people on Facebook, or you have a page that has 20,000 people, but maybe Facebook is only showing it to like 200 of them, right? And so you lose control over reaching your audience. This is why I think that those who are really concerned about getting their message out have to consider building their own platform outside of these controls. That means you need a direct way to contact the people. Usually it's email, right? Sometimes it can be text or snail mail, right? If you want to pay out the nose. But usually we're talking about email. Building an email list, having a way to directly reach out to the people that matter, sending your thoughts out there, writing books, right, and getting this out into people's homes. I think there's alternative pathways outside of these systems. And that's one thing that I'm concerned about is, as great as these platforms are, I mean, I use Facebook heavily to get ideas out there. You're still subject to control. You're still subject to that business going away. I mean, okay, MySpace used to be a thought delivery platform, and then it went poof, right? So I think it's good for us to think about building our own platform to get our ideas directly to people rather than relying at least entirely upon these platforms. Because if we care about free speech, we don't want to be subject to some company either going away or shutting us down all of a sudden.
No, I think that's an excellent point. Something we have to consider too is our own thinking, and this is the hardest part. Would if somebody were to ask you to consider, Connor, do you ever operate under a delusion?
I don't know. Am I delusional for not immediately having an answer? No,
but I mean, that's a tough question to ask yourself, because look, all of us are our own greatest champions. All right, wait a minute. I'm a good guy. I'm not going to be wrong about something like that. But if we can find the courage to admit, maybe I don't know all the answers. Now, that doesn't mean you walk around in a permanent state of indecision or indecisiveness. It just means you allow for the idea that for all the facts that I do know, or for all the things that I have proven to myself, there are still things that I don't know. And I think this is essential if you ever want to go about changing anybody else's mind. I'm going to harken back to the college campuses here for just a moment. The reaction that we sometimes see to speech that is not wanted, that would either contradict or would challenge a point of view that holds sway on those campuses, the response is a lower, more animalistic type of chanting, sometimes even violence, because they're not in a position where they can engage that higher level of thought. And I'm only offering this with the caution that I've been there myself, and it's something we have to be on guard against too, that we don't fall into that. If you find yourself insisting that somebody has to agree with you, that's probably a good danger signal that you should back off a little bit and evaluate. What am I really trying to do? Am I trying to win here, or am I trying to help somebody see something that could be beneficial? And if they don't want to see it, sometimes the answer is you just have to say, okay, smile and, move on. You planted a seed, hopefully.
And I think that's what it's often about, is it's planting seeds. You're not going to be victorious in the debate immediately. You're not going to suddenly change people's minds. Effective free speech is a long game, right? Because speech is about communicating an idea, and people don't instantly reconsider their delusions and their biases and change their opinions overnight. So this is a long game, and it does require patience. And that's something my younger self would not abide either, right? So it's something that we've had to learn.
How do you feel about the approach of, can I change a lot of people's minds? In other words, can I really affect some kind of change among the masses? Or are we talking about something that has to take place on a more intimate, personal level?
Well, I think everything, right, is individual. I think it's very easy to kind of speak in generalities and collectivist terms, but even when you're shifting a group of people, you're talking to individuals. And there are group dynamics. There is the network effect. There is peer pressure and social proof. But at the end of the day, those are all influences on the individual. And if you're a good marketer, you're using psychological effects to achieve your end goal, right? So you're using things, understanding a little bit of how the human brain works. You're exercising your speech in a way that kind of takes advantage of those psychological effects, whether it's group effects or whatnot. So I think at the end of the day, we have to talk individually. We have to talk about one person at a time. And hopefully it's one person at a time, but very quickly, right? Or we're talking to 1,000 people at a time, but we got to think that, each of those people are going to listen differently. They have different experiences. They have different motives, incentives. And so that's where I think it's too easy to think, oh, I'm going to go give this great speech and convert a bunch of people. But I, at least for me, when I do speaking, especially, I try and think like, who are the specific types of people who show up to this, and how can I make it relevant to them? How do I talk to them? And then, of course, if you think that way, it's going to apply to many people who kind of fit that criteria, at least loosely. So I think it's good to always think of it as an individual thing. What are your thoughts?
I think you just hit on one of the greatest keys to success that any public speaker is ever going to discover. And it took me a while for this to come to me, or someone to tell me about it and explain it and go, oh. And it's not about what you say so much. It's not about what is going to make Connor look the best speaking to this group of people. The really great public speakers are the ones who look at their audience and try to determine as best they can, what do they need? And you have to break it down. It could be one individual. I know in this audience there's going to be a lot of people who this may not apply to, but there's one individual for whom this is going to make the difference. I liken it to an example a friend told me years ago about, if you need to fill a bunch of milk bottles, you could stand there with a fire hose and just, turn loose on a row of milk bottles. And you might actually get some water inside one or two of them, but mostly you're just going to knock them every which way. That's the mass, full blast approach. Well, we've got to get this information out here. I don't have any time to waste. The more patient and effective way is to individually take those milk bottles and carefully, one by one, fill them. And that takes time, and it gives a sense that, well, I could be filling so many more, but you want them to stay filled. And again, this isn't suggesting that you're trying to tell those poor simple-minded folks how to think. It's just, if you want to have that impact, like you said, the individual approach is really where that change starts to take place.
You said a word, impact. And I think at the end of the day, that is the goal. We're not saying speech to just blow off steam. I often share this example. People who write their rants and use their free speech to, say whatever's on their mind and be critical and whatever, they're letting off steam so often. They're just letting off steam, right? I used to do this. Just
well, it feels good.
It feels good. You're burning up, right? You're on fire. You got to let off that steam. Steam can move massive locomotives. Steam, when you harness that energy, can do amazing things. But you have to channel it. You have to capture it. You have to use it productively and wisely. That, I think, is, you said the word impact. I think we have to care not only about the long game, but we have to care about effectively using our speech so that we're actually making a difference and not just venting, right? Because after you vent a bajillion times, you realize how much time you're wasting. And so let's apply that steam. Let's capture it. So I want to share a couple quick ideas that I think are important, because at the end of the day, speech is not just about changing minds. It's about impact. It's about action. We want people to change and do things. One of the most important things I think we need to do is to, and this is just a general recommendation, is to reduce friction. And by that, I mean, this is from my online marketing background. If you want someone to fill out a form, you don't want there to be 30 fields in it, because that's a lot of friction. That's a lot of things they have to do before they click the submit button and pay you or send you their email address. You want there to be one box, right? You want it to be simple. You want the button to be bright, clearly visible in the right place, et cetera, et cetera. You want to reduce the friction so that it's easier for that person to act, okay? And this applies to all marketing, so it applies equally to speech. We have to reduce friction. And so if we want someone to do something, maybe it's sign a petition, right? Again, petition has to be easy to sign. We have to easily get it to them. It has to be a clear call to action. Now, I think petitions are largely ineffective, right? But at the end of the day, that is one goal that you can do with speech. Finding people who agree with you on a cause, who are willing to just say, I agree. Let's stand together. My first, I say they're ineffective, but the way I got started in politics, Brian, I don't know if you know this, and periodically I'm reminded of this, and then I keep forgetting it, and then 2 years later I remember this. My first political action was in Texas when authorities raided the Yearning for Zion Ranch, the polygamous compound. And there was an anonymous tip that was fake. It was this woman alleging that she was being abused. And so authorities swooped in on this. They took out like 400 children, removed all the kids from the compound because they were operating based on this tip of abuse, which was false, right? And so massive civil liberties violation. These children were legally kidnapped. I'm here in another state. I'm not very political, but I see this and I'm like, that is horrible, right? And this is 2000, I don't know, 7, I want to say. And so I started a petition. And, back in those days of the internet, blogging had just taken off in 2005. So I kind of had a blog going and it was gaining popularity. And then 2007 comes along and you've got these little petitions that are these, cool, effective online things. And they weren't as, everywhere as they are today and not as powerful and whatever. So we did a petition. I think we got 1,000 signatures, if I remember right, forwarded it to Senator so-and-so and Governor so-and-so, and we got a bunch of press out of it. And that's the thing that I want to mention here. Speech, if you're using it strategically, it's not just about the action. It's about what the action can trigger. So the petition, right? Like, petition isn't like no politician's going to, 1,000 people signed this, so therefore I'm
right on it.
I must comply, right? Even when you have like the change.org petitions, I know Obama and his administration, they said if you got a certain number of petitions, we will have a response. And I don't know that they ended up always doing that, but so petitions can be effective if you leverage them for other things. And a related example, also from early in my political career, we mentioned this a few episodes back with Angela Keaton about building a peace movement, and that was doing billboards. And so we used our speech. We had a plan to have some controversial speech at the time about the war, the pending war with Iran and all the saber rattling. We decided to pool some resources, spend some money, and we got national news coverage for this. I mean, Angela, a decade later, is still talking about it and using it to talk to other people about how you can do pro-peace activism. And so that speech is not just about whoever happened to see it on the freeway for the month or two that we had it put up, for them to be educated. It totally was, right? That was like the acute impact of exercising our speech. We want it to be in your face. But the strategic goal was to leverage that action to have a much broader impact. And so that's where I think those who are concerned about free speech aren't thinking big enough. And one group that's doing it pretty well, I think, Brian, you mentioned college campuses. We talked to someone from FIRE a few episodes back about the free speech issue on college campuses. The Young Americans for Liberty are doing a pretty good job. Some of their events, their stunts, is they'll do a free speech wall on campus. And they'll just put up this stationary wall with paper, and people can come up and just say whatever they want. And you're inviting people, very low friction, like here's a Sharpie. Mm-hmm. What do you want to say, right? Very easy. You write your message on the wall, you share your thoughts. And that's very empowering for people, right? Very liberating.
I saw another example of this on a college campus that I thought was actually very clever. Steven Crowder is a guy who, he's pretty flashy sometimes, but I thought this was one of his more thoughtful attempts to start a dialogue. He set up a couple of chairs, set up a table, and a little banner that said, "I'm pro-gun, change my mind." And invited people who were walking by to sit down, and they had a very nice, very reasonable discussion. And of course, somebody called the police and said, "Hey, do you have a permit?" And they ushered him off. But I thought, what a great way to start the conversation.
But it's funny you say that because it's so permit oriented. You're not in the free speech zone. We have the special zone over there where you're allowed to practice your free speech. The beauty about this stuff, the example you shared, the free speech wall that the Young Americans for Liberty sometimes do, is there's also creative ways to get around it. So Young Americans for Liberty, where they have problems with the free speech wall, one of their stunts that they'll do instead is they'll get a free speech beach ball, this massive beach ball, and they'll just roll it around because they're no longer stationary. And they'll have people sign the ball, right, and walk around with Sharpies. And suddenly they're not in violation of the ordinances. So it's not only to just say, hey, free speech is great, but it's also there's a very important call to action. Hey, look, our university codes are violating your rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so there has to be a call to action. We have to have patience, think about the long game, but we also have to be strategic. And this is what I think more of us can do better at, is think about how we can market, how we can be strategic to make an impact bigger than just typing something on Facebook or writing a blog post.
I'll offer one final thought, too, and that is you need to be a little bit courageous. Example of this. Just saw a video earlier this week of, it was filmed during a public school, high school, it looked like, during the Pledge of Allegiance. So someone's leading the pledge over the loudspeaker. Most of the students are standing, but there's a kid sitting in his desk quietly, not doing the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, that is free speech. Like it or not, he's exercising free speech. Well, another student comes up behind him and says something to him. You can't hear what he says, but then he takes his leg and he sweeps the chair out from under the student who's sitting down. It dumps him right on the ground. And I only point this out because you're going to encounter opposition. And so you're going to need courage. Sometimes free speech means you have to be the person who's willing to not do what everybody else is doing. And if you can keep your cool, if you can maintain that strategic mindset that Connor was just referencing, it will serve you very well. But you need to think ahead and understand that sometimes free speech is going to be received in not such popular ways. So thanks for joining us on this. Think about how you will exercise free speech. Be bold, but be sweet about it. And we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.